Okay, so let's take a look at some actual photographs here from World War One. Now, this isn't necessarily a shot of the trenches. What we have here is what we would just simply call mobilization. So we can tell it's early in the war. These men here are walking down a path, likely moving towards a trench position of some sort. You can see there's still foliage on these trees. These guys don't seem to be in any hurry, so they're likely moving into position here. Now, this is an actual a trench here. Now, this is one of two options. This is either a trench here that was designed as an entry point into the trench system. So, you think about that idea. Getting into the trenches itself, you had to actually have cover. As you got closer to the battlefield here, you had to find a way to safely get men into the trenches. But in all likelihood, this is probably more a training ground here. So they would use these shallow trenches, which you can see are only about as deep as the height of a man. And these men here would likely be in the process of being trained in how to use various weapons and on tactics and procedures about life in the trenches. Now, this is obviously this is a training scene here, and we can see this is the machine gun that characterized World War One. One version of a machine gun. And you can see, quite interestingly, the machine gun itself, big weapon, not something that men would carry around and, fire from their hip. Don't think like Arnold Schwarzenegger and Commando here. This was a big, heavy weapon that required two men to operate. Now, you essentially, so this circular piece here was where the bullets would be inside of, and the barrel itself often would rotate so you could fire off multiple bullets at a time. Now, the second guy here, his responsibility was twofold. In fact, maybe more important than this guy. Number one, he reloaded the weapon, so he was the one that was cautious in watching the ammunition. But number two, he was actually the spotter. He was the eyes. The guy firing the machine gun here, really, he was just a trigger man. Because when he would depress the trigger, this machine gun would violently shake, right? You can imagine it's a very powerful weapon. So it wouldn't allow his eyes to focus. So the guy who's beside him is actually, he's the spotter. He's the guy that is telling him where to aim. So this is not really a skilled sort of weapon. It takes some of the romance out of warfare. It was just to hang on and moving around in sort of sweeping motions to try to kill as many men as possible. What you see here, this is what was called a trench mortar. Now, this was used in areas where the trench position, the front lines were very close. This was a weapon that had a range of about 200 meters. So it would fire off a small shell that would sort of be like punting a football, and it would make a thumping sound. Now, these were dangerous because they didn't have a large explosion, but you didn't have much time. You had about 6 seconds when the trench mortar was discharged, and you could hear it. Men would have to sort of scan the sky, and they had about 6 seconds to determine whether or not that shell was coming near them. So they would have to obviously try to gather some cover if possible. All right, so this is get a sense here of the sort of training conditions that men were subject to with these new weapons of war. Here we've got a great picture of that artillery position, the artillery cannon. So well and behind the lines, you can see here. And these guys would have been called sappers. They were very important. They were engineers, and they were essentially the construction battalion. So they built, they were responsible for all the construction challenges that were that came along with trench warfare. So they would set up these sort of primitive rail lines here, which would allow them to move heavy shells into place here, and then shells would be stacked up, as you could see here, near the cannons, and that would have been part of the responsibility of the artillery, was to coordinate this whole effort here. And they would have this sort of primitive cover here so that they could cover up the weapons. And you want to cover up your shells, right? You don't want the enemy, if they're flying a plane here, to know just how big of a buildup you have, how many shells you've got. So so this is well and behind the trees, you can see here. So these guys were quite honestly, they were firing blind into enemy positions. And if the information was bad information as far as where the shells were landing, they would sometimes hit their own men.